Russia underscores continued support from major partner Beijing after failed coup on Moscow over the weekend. Its ambassador to China says both act in the interest of an open, inclusive security system.
I want to pick up now on the strife in Russia. Dr Chernyshova joins us live from Moscow. Dasha, it's been 4 days since the attempted insurrection by the Wagner Group. Still scant on details. What are you hearing on the deal that's been made?
Well, indeed, as the Russian president has promised, the fighters of the Wagner mercenary group will not be prosecuted. Instead, they will be offered to sign contracts with Russia's Ministry of Defense. That is according to the president himself, and as well as according to the Kremlin. So now we understand they will have a choice either to join the regular Russian army as either maybe as volunteer detachments or any other way, or just to go back home. That's the understanding for them at the moment. But anyway, the criminal cases have been dropped, and the Federal Security Services have confirmed that there is no criminal case against Wagner for the incitement of armed rebellion. Now, we also have heard from Russia's Ministry of Defense that Wagner has been preparing to transfer the heavy weaponry to the regular Russian army. That's another proof that this group will not be operational in the Russian Federation. And also, we have heard from Yevgeny Prigozhin himself that he would be going to Belarus. However, it's not immediately clear whether he is there at the moment or not. Understanding is that his plane has landed in Minsk, but this is yet to be confirmed. Alexander Lukashenko has said himself, the Belarusian leader who actually brokered this deal, has said himself that Wagner fighters should not be feared of. So the understanding in Russia is very clear. The Wagner chief has been declared a traitor. The activities that have been unraveling over the course of this weekend have been described as the stab in the back. So certainly now the presence of Yevgeny Prigozhin on the Russian territory is quite unwelcome by the Russian authorities.
And Dasha, what's being read there into China's unwavering support for Russia, despite a failed mutiny and rising suspicions of instability in President Putin's authority?
Well, certainly the Russian president has had a number of contacts over the course of this past weekend and the first days of this week with international leaders, gathering support and vouching their support for his government. But also, and the understanding is that on Saturday, there was a visit by Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Rudenko to China, where all of these issues have been discussed. And again, Beijing has vouched, Russia has vouched the support from Beijing. But also, China has reaffirmed that in a meeting that the two countries were acting in the interest of creating what they have described as an equal, open, inclusive security system in the region, because the understanding in Moscow is that it is the Western countries that are trying to destabilize the situation. So certainly, as we have heard before, the two countries are having their partnership, all-encompassing dialogue, and they want to reiterate that this is the case. But at the same time, in Russia, the authorities maintain that they could have been, that they were able to quell the mutiny anyway, even if Prigozhin didn't turn around his convoy. So Moscow is trying also to make it clear to the public, at least here, that they had the situation under their control.
All right, many thanks for that. Dr Chernyshova reporting from Moscow.
I said to Dr Precious Chatterje-Doody. She's a lecturer in politics and international studies at the Open University and joins us live from Redcar in the United Kingdom. Dr. Doody, we just heard there from our correspondent on what she considers strong support from China. But this kind of rhetorical support we've heard all this time. China supports, and this is from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it supports Russia maintaining national stability. China considers this an internal affair for Russia itself to manage. And of course, you have the Deputy Foreign Minister from Russia visiting China over the weekend as well, although we do not know if that is actually tied to what happened over the weekend. From your point of view, how do you assess China's support, and could anything happen to change that level of support?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that there is quite a long-term strategic basis for Russian-Chinese cooperation. It goes back a long way, but it's always had like a largely pragmatic basis. Now, for China, as for many countries in the world, a stable Russia is an easier Russia to deal with. I think that's the baseline. But in addition to this, both Russia and China have quite a particular perspective on the wider world and the institutions in it. You know, the leaderships of both countries genuinely see the current world order as being unfair, as one that privileges the interests of the Western established powers to the detriment of players like China and Russia. So, you know, there are kind of longer standing reasons why they would want to create a show of unity. Now, I wouldn't interpret that as meaning that China is, you know, behind Putin personally all the way, but he is the person who is in charge of Russia and the kind of strongest bet at the moment. And so, of course, that's how that support's going to manifest itself. And I think for China, there's also quite uncomfortable parallels. You know, the idea that an authoritarian leader can be challenged from within is really quite an uncomfortable thought for the Xi leadership. And so, of course, they want to play this down. And the two countries have got quite a long tradition of learning from one another about how you can best manage public discontent in such a way as to keep it at a manageable level in order to ensure regime stability, basically. So I think there's a lot of angles on this support that we're seeing from China.
Another angle we could look at, you can talk about China's, I suppose, very visceral aversion to instability in the country. Perhaps it's less visceral, but we've seen it in the last few days in Washington, in the EU, in the G7 countries, all saying no one has any interest in civil war in Russia. But if they are supporting Ukraine to the extent that they are, they could be looking at defeat of the Putin regime and then this kind of catastrophic implosion of the Putin regime. What does so-called US-led Western allies want to see in terms of their support for Ukraine and the result in Russia?
You know, this is a really difficult question because, of course, there are certain principles that all of the Western nations are on board with. Primarily amongst those is that each state in the international system has a sovereign right to determine its own future. And that's kind of why this issue with the invasion of Ukraine has become so charged, because it gets at the heart of a key principle of international law that Ukraine should be able to choose its own direction. Now, of course, nobody wants to see instability in Russia. None of the global powers do, because an unstable power is an unpredictable power. And international relations and diplomacy, they work much better when there's some element of predictability. Even if you might not necessarily agree or approve of the decisions of a leader, you have a better chance of mitigating them, of dealing with them when you can predict them. Now, I think what everyone in the international community is quite aware of is that Putin is to some extent a known quantity, although he's been very unpredictable in the past few years, I suppose. But it's very difficult to predict what might come in a notional post-Putin future. And I think that's what everyone's quite concerned about, because, you know, in the case of Prigozhin, who never did have really the elite support to have taken this kind of much further than he did. But nonetheless, it's not the case that he would have been, you know, a more benevolent figure than Putin. You know, we know he has his own history of war crimes and worse as well. So the idea that we could just bank on it being better if there was a total collapse of the Putin regime, I think, is a fallacy. And I think that's something that really is playing on the mind of many international leaders.
And a final question here, Dr. Chatterje-Doody. Now, one leader who has unequivocally backed Vladimir Putin and who has been very clear about who he wants to win all the way, also the man of the hour on the weekend when he negotiated the end of the Wagner Group attempted insurrection. Of course, that is Belarus's President Alexander Lukashenko. Where is he now? Strengthened or weakened? Final question.
This has been a great coup for him. You know, it's absolutely catapulted him to significant regional relevance, which is a position he's wanted to maintain for a long time, but where he's been subservient for many years to Putin, essentially a client of Putin. By the same token, you know, for Putin, this is quite embarrassing to have his former client basically ride to his aid. And I think in general, this really underscores the importance of those kind of personalized elements of politics. We sometimes forget them when we talk about the geopolitical aspects, but these personal aspects can quite have significant impacts on how things turn out. And I think it'll be quite interesting in the weeks and months to come to watch how the impacts of this kind of personal power play manifests itself in the ongoing relationships, not only between players in the region, but also on those internal dynamics in those countries.
Thanks so much for joining us this evening, Dr. Precious Chatterje-Doody, speaking to us live from Redcar in the United Kingdom.